large yellow house. So out the carriage house doors, and just the building right behind us here. We are looking forward to several other events coming up this month. We are commemorating and celebrating Black History Month with our friends at the 10 Million Names Project, the Slave Legacy History Coalition, and First Church in Cambridge, with a really wonderful conversation on Monday, February 12th at 6 p.m. down at First Church. If you'd like to join us for that, it's another free event. We'll be hearing from Dr. Carrie Greenwich, Dr. Kendra Field, and Dr. Vincent Brown. So another all-star lineup talking about the new 10 Million Names genealogical project. And then we are celebrating Henry Longfellow's 217th birthday with Mount Auburn Cemeteries, also our wonderful partners in this program this evening, with a marathon reading of Evangeline. If you have been to a Moby Dick marathon reading, all 25 hours of it, this will be a little shorter, about 1 hour long. But we're looking forward to doing that, having some cake and celebrating him at the graveside as well. So I'd love to introduce our speakers for this evening. In the long sleepless watches of the night, we will be exploring the culture of death, bereavement, and mourning in the antebellum period with Tegan Kehoe and Paul Lewis. I will introduce our speakers and then you'll hear from them, and then we should have some time for a good conversation here tonight as well. So as they speak, you've got some poetry in your hands. As questions or comments percolate in your minds, hold those and we'll have a chance for conversation at the end. So to introduce our speakers, Tegan Kehoe is a public historian, museum curator, and writer. She specializes in the history of healthcare and science in society with a social history angle. Kehoe is the research and public programs director at the Paul Revere House. And prior to this role, she was the exhibit and education specialist at the Paul S. Russell Museum of Medical History and Innovation at Mass General Hospital. Her main research interests include material culture and the history of medicine, interpretation strategies for histories of medicine in the body, and the history of scientific methodologies. Tegan Kehoe is also the author of Exploring American Healthcare Through 50 Historic Treasures, which is a really wonderful book published in 2021 by the American Association for State and Local History. And if you want to hear more from Tegan after this evening, you can go on our YouTube and hear a really great conversation that she did in 2021 with our archivist about the history of the use of obstetric anesthesia in relation to the Longfellow. Paul Lewis is a professor of English emeritus at Boston College. He's an Americanist, past president of the Poe Studies Association, and the curator of exhibitions on literary Boston. He is also the author of many books, including Cracking Up American Humor in a Time of Conflict, Comic Effects and Interdisciplinary Approaches to Humor in Literature, and A is for Asteroids, Z is for Zombies, a bedtime book for the coming apocalypse. Lewis also led the Boston Poems Project and edited the Citizen Poems of Boston, a collection of forgotten poems, which is one of my favorites, 1789 to 1820. He's also the board chair of the Edgar Allan Poe Foundation of Boston. His work to celebrate Poe in the city of his birth. And in addition to articles and book chapters on American literature, controversial humor, and literary Boston, he has published opinion, humor, and feature pieces in places like the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, and many other outlets. So we are in wonderful, wonderful company this evening, and I will turn it over to you. Thank you, all of you, for being here as well.
Thank you, Emily, and good evening, everyone. I'll be starting us off by speaking about the medical and social context for death in antebellum America. Many of us go through periods in our lives when death feels ever present. While I had experienced death and grief and loss before, the first such period for me was spring of 2022 through the spring of 2023, and it felt like the hits just kept coming, with deaths both anticipated and unanticipated. I've researched topics related to death, dying, and loss for years as part of my work on the social history of health and medicine, and I have to say the material hits differently these days. What we're discussing tonight might resonate differently for each of you. Please do take care of yourselves as you need to. Also, one of the challenges of doing history well is avoiding the temptation to let the present color our understanding of the past. But I do think that we can still embrace what's powerful about sharing human experiences across eras. In America in the first half of the 19th century, the feeling that death was ever present existed on a cultural level, in addition to anyone's personal feelings that death was pervasive. A culture's approach to illness, death, and loss is a giant set of topics, but it's even larger when looking at antebellum America. So in order to give you a sampling of medical and social contexts that the bereaved found themselves in, I'd like to share some of the contexts for losses experienced by the poets we're discussing tonight. That's Longfellow, of course, and Edgar Allan Poe. Both of them were deeply affected by the loss of their wife. And in the interest of time, I'm really only speaking of these women as people who died, rather than telling you a bit about them as people first. But I hope that sharing their images as I'm speaking about these contexts will honor them a little bit. Before I advance to the next slide, I do want to let you know that this is a watercolor that was made after death. So, prepare yourself for that if that might be uncomfortable for you. Poe lost his much younger wife, Virginia Eliza Poe, to tuberculosis when she was 24. One of the telltale symptoms is coughing up blood, and this was the first symptom that she noticed 5 years before her death. TB is primarily a lung disease, but it also causes fever, weakness, and weight loss, so victims were often thought to be wasting away. People in this era knew very little about where disease comes from. Many people believed that tuberculosis was hereditary. It isn't, but it is most easily spread in close quarters over long periods of time, so people who live together, such as families, were likely to pass it to one another, and so could appear to run in a family. TB was also very often attributed to someone having a weak constitution or specifically a tubercular one. Because the disease killed over the course of many years, many patients would try numerous different things to try to restore their health or their strength. And often they were trying both regular and irregular medicine. Irregular medicine is what we might call alternative medicine today. So that includes naturopaths, herbalists, homeopaths, hydropaths, and more. I think all of those except for hydropaths are still in currency. For tuberculosis in particular, both regular and irregular medicine believed that fresh air was important, and this may have been why Virginia and her husband moved several times in the last years of her life in search of a more healthful environment for her. Another effect of the fact that TB killed its victims slowly was that a mythology built up around people living with the disease. At least if the patient was middle class or wealthy, it was considered a highly romantic way to die. It was long and drawn out, and that gave people plenty of time to contemplate their own mortality and make meaning from it. The consumptive look, so called because TB is also called consumption, became highly fashionable among Victorians. Patients were frail with translucent pale skin and the sparkling eyes and rosy cheeks of a low-grade fever. So for women, this look was considered very feminine. And for men, it was the tragic look of a poetic soul. Consumption was associated with dying young for obvious reasons. And in the kind of cultural context, that meant it was associated with innocence. And consumptives in literature were often portrayed as angelic. This is, again, largely for the middle and upper classes. It was considered something very different and very dirty and gross if it happened to someone who was poor, which is the subject of many other lectures I could give. Virginia died in 1847, and a few hours after her death, a watercolor painting of her corpse was made. And it's the only authenticated image of her. And it may be that her husband had this painting done because he didn't have any other images of her, which was a common reason to have a postmortem painting done. But in antebellum America, many postmortem images portrayed the subject as though they were still alive. So this is unusual somewhat in that respect. You wouldn't necessarily know by looking at her, but she's not, up and posing in her garden the way many of these subjects might have been. Photography studios started to become widespread in the 1850s. And soon after that, the genre of postmortem photography began to flourish. So this was not portraying people as though they were alive. It was portraying them either on their deathbed or after death, either alone or surrounded by mourners. Tuberculosis was the leading cause of death in the United States when Virginia died. It's actually still a leading cause globally, but it's rare in the United States, and there are big socioeconomic disparities in who is most vulnerable and who might think of it as a disease of the past. In the 19th century, it touched most communities, although wealthy patients did have a longer life expectancy. One of Longfellow's sisters died of tuberculosis, also in young adulthood. And Longfellow lost his first wife to complications of pregnancy and childbirth, a tragedy that is similarly more stratified by wealth today than it was in their time. Longfellow married Mary Storer Potter in 1831. The pair had been childhood friends. 4 years later, she suffered a late miscarriage, about 6 months into her pregnancy. Prenatal care, as we know it, was largely a 20th century development. Many of the technologies that would make it possible to know what went wrong, let alone begin to respond, are from the mid-20th century or more recent. After losing her fetus, Mary grew very sick, and she died several weeks later. Childbirth was a very risky thing. Whether after a miscarriage or a live birth, one of the most common causes of death related to childbearing in the antebellum era was infection. At the time, many doctors considered childbed fever or puerperal fever, catch-all names for any postpartum infection, to be unavoidable. You may have noticed that when I discussed TB, I didn't mention anyone who blamed germs or microbes for the disease. The same was true for post-childbirth infections. And that's because while the existence of microbes or microscopic organisms had been known to scientists since Antony van Leeuwenhoek's discoveries in the 17th century, a few scientific pioneers were just beginning to explore the idea that some microbes were the germs or seeds of disease in the 1860s. The germ theory wasn't widely accepted among doctors until the 1870s into the 1880s. A century earlier, in the 1780s and again in the 1840s, just a few doctors independently raised concerns about contagion. Each of them suggested that if doctors washed their hands between patients, they could reduce the rates of puerperal fever. And they were ridiculed at the time. In fact, in many hospitals for the poor, doctors went straight from working with infectious patients or even corpses to the delivery room. And in this area, those who could afford private doctors were beginning to prefer them over midwives for home deliveries. But regardless of who attended the birth, pregnancy and childbirth were commonly understood to be a dangerous time, one that might signify either loss or joy. Grappling with the deaths of infants and children was a big part of antebellum mourning culture. Infants who didn't get enough milk often starved. And when sanitation was poorly understood and the only vaccine available was for smallpox, early childhood diseases struck most families and survival rates varied widely. At a time when doctors barely understood disease, ordinary people saw illness strike seemingly at random. They learned some of the patterns of when their children were most vulnerable, but they couldn't do much to protect them. And so illnesses such as cholera that often came and went seasonally ended up being nicknamed things like summer complaint or autumnal fever because people were recognizing those patterns. Infants were also more likely to die of childhood diseases around the time that they were weaned and lost the protection of antibodies. But with no concept of antibodies in breast milk, many people believed that it was teething that made children sick. Another thing that, while they might see the pattern, they didn't know anything to do about that. And you can't prevent your child from teething. People found various ways to attempt to cope with the possibility of losing their children. A minority of parents didn't name their babies until they were a year old, waiting until the worst of the danger of infancy had passed. You can see evidence of this in graveyards with headstones for baby or child. The practice tapered off in the late 19th century, so it did stick around for quite some time. Religious verse about children's death was a popular genre in the antebellum era. Bereaved parents included these poems in obituaries and on headstones, such as, "Mourn not for me, dear mother, I shall soon be at rest. My weary head I shall soon lean upon my Savior's breast." However, living children were also sometimes assigned to transcribe poems like these in school or embroidered them on samplers. Death was ever present, and not even the young were allowed to forget it. After losing his wife and unborn child in 1835, Longfellow remarried in 1843. He and Frances Appleton, who went by Fanny, had 6 children together, and happily 5 of them lived to adulthood. They lost their third child, also named Fanny, in infancy, but Longfellow wasn't done with personal tragedy, as I imagine that many of you know. Francis Appleton Longfellow died unexpectedly in 1861. Her dress caught fire in an accident, probably either from a candle flame, burning wax, or a dropped match. She was severely burned and died of her injuries the next day. Her husband was badly burned himself while trying to save her. There's some history mythology around how common this type of tragedy actually was in the era of open flames and huge skirts. Accidentally burning to death was probably more common than it is today, but not to the extent that some accounts would have you believe. But one aspect of Fanny's death was very typical of her time, and that's that she died at home. The family sent for a doctor who came to her. The few places that did have ambulances used them to convey doctors to their patients, not the other way around. And this kind of service was typically limited to wartime and sometimes as part of the response to an epidemic. It wasn't an everyday option. And scientific burn care wasn't developed until the first half of the 20th century. So there was really no benefit to getting Fanny to a hospital. The Longfellows likely never saw the inside of a hospital, except for their son Charles, who was injured during the Civil War. Before germ theory, hospitals were dangerous places, and civilian hospitals were typically a last resort for the poor to receive care. The various infections that patients often acquired while staying at a hospital were collectively termed hospitalism and often considered unavoidable. If you had to have an inpatient stay, you would develop hospitalism at some point. Most people, but especially the middle and upper classes, died at home, whether their death was unexpected or long anticipated. People lived with a lot of uncertainty about death. Even more than today, loved ones could be taken from you at any time. One of the cultural effects of this was that frequent reminders of mortality were popular in art and literature, as well as in funeral customs. But if you've ever read the words memento mori in Latin in art, that's remember death or remember that you will die, you know that this reminder isn't exclusive to the time period that we're talking about. So what's noteworthy of the era is the way that they chose to make meaning of death and mourning. The rise of Romanticism and in art and literature at the end of the 18th century was an important element. Mourning itself was highly romanticized, and it was much more socially acceptable for both men and women to be open in their grieving than in much of American culture today. The early 19th century also saw the rise of sentimental literature written for women and by women, and one genre within this movement was consolation literature, which provided an outlet for outpourings of grief and helped to solidify a heavenly life after death. Etiquette manuals participated in this phenomenon as well by offering instruction on mourning rituals and funeral customs. Much of mourning culture, as you might imagine for this era, had a deeply religious cast to it. Many people saw death as being called home to heaven to be with family who predeceased them. Outside of the pulpits of any particular denomination, the Protestant mainstream in this period also cultivated a belief that grieving for others and contemplating your own mortality was spiritually purifying and made a person more moral. Morality was also associated with being a good citizen and participating in the attitudes and behaviors of gentility and refinement. And all of these ideas came together in the creation of what were termed rural cemeteries or garden cemeteries, large park-like cemeteries in suburbs or on the outskirts of cities. These cemeteries had a public health benefit in that they were bringing corpses outside of the areas that were most densely populated. But they were also meticulously landscaped to provide all of the spiritually beneficial effects of nature and introspection, as well as of grief. So the people creating these cemeteries saw themselves as improving the citizens by giving them an opportunity to practice these purifying behaviors that were likely to produce refinement in them. Visitors walked through gently rolling hills and along gradually turning pathways and contemplated eternity. Mount Auburn Cemetery, founded in 1831, was the first of its kind in America. It became the resting place of many Boston and Cambridge luminaries, eventually including Longfellow. And between this and its ambiance, Mount Auburn became a major travel destination. This isn't to say that everyone who visited Mount Auburn in its first decades came for the same reasons. Many people did treat it as a public park or even kind of like a fairgrounds, and were not at all reverent. But many came not just from the Boston area, but from many miles away, specifically to have an emotional or sentimental experience, regardless of whether they had any personal connection to the people buried there. Mourning culture continued to swell throughout the 19th century and only collapsed around the First World War. Many people note the American Civil War as a turning point in mourning culture, after which point mourning culture really exploded and flourished. And that was in part because of the Civil War and the large losses of life, especially young men. And the Civil War was also the point at which post-mortem photography became widespread, and when embalming became widespread. And coincidentally, it was the same time when England's Prince Albert died of typhoid fever, and the widowed Queen Victoria became a trendsetter in very public, ritualized mourning. But scholars describe the period before the Civil War as obsessed with death. Even if the rituals around mourning weren't as showy as they would become in the later Victorian era, it was very much on people's minds. Historian Mark S. Shantz has noted that a comprehensive study of attitudes towards death in this era would require studying almost everything written or created for a span of some 60 years. Death was rarely far from people's minds. The reasons for this obsession aren't simple to discern, and there's surprisingly little scholarship on the question. Certainly, some of the contributing factors were a sense of powerlessness over death because of the state of medical science at the time, and a common sense of intimacy with death because most people died at home. But these factors aren't unique to this period, as we already discussed. And I think that pairing discussion of mourning culture in this era in particular with discussions of expressions of grief in literature is very appropriate, because much of what's most important about antebellum mourning culture is not well pinned down. So it's fitting for a literary scholar to pick up where the historian leaves off. And with that, I'll turn it over to Paul.
Tegan, thank you so much. And Emily, thank you for sticking with this program through scheduling and rescheduling. And it's funny, I'm going to pick up right where Tegan left off. Before I turn to Edgar Allan Poe and Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, and by way of transition from Tegan's talk to my own, I'll start by observing that decades of historicist research have demonstrated the value of reading literary works, not as distinct from or above cultural context, but as part of the often turbulent flow of debates that have animated public life in the United States from the start. To put this another way, although Longfellow and Poe participated in what Karen Haltunen described as, quote, a social life pervaded by the rituals of endless mourning, end quote, they brought different life experiences and aesthetic principles to the subject. Radically different ideas about what poems should do, that is, how they should affect readers and what role they should play in society, led Poe and Longfellow to approach contemporaneous cultural motifs, practices, and norms differently in their works, and in Poe's case, to repeatedly criticize Longfellow. For example, in his 1842 review of Longfellow's ballads and other poems, Poe snarked, quote, didacticism is the prevalent tone of his song. His invention, his imagery, his all is made subservient to the elucidation of some one or more points, but rarely of more than one, which he looks on as truth, end quote. Because Longfellow was backward looking, or rather steeped in literary tradition, and especially because he was a leading practitioner of what Poe called the heresy of the didactic. Poe predicted that Longfellow's reputation would not endure, that he would have no place, quote, in the future. Unaware of and thus undisturbed by the prophetic accuracy of Poe's prediction, in his diary entry on February 24th, 1847, Longfellow wrote, quote, in hexameters sing serenely a Harvard professor. In pentameter him dance censorious Poe. Longfellow again struck this pose of serenity a year after Poe's death in September 1850 in his reply to an inquiry from editor and anthologist Rufus W. Griswold. Griswold was soliciting Longfellow's reaction to Poe's charge that Longfellow had plagiarized from Poe. If, quote, Longfellow wrote, if you should resume this subject in print, I wish you would contrive to leave me entirely out of it. I dislike all controversy and violent discussion and never have taken part in any and never intend to do so. Despite Longfellow's admirable disdain for critical argument, the contest between literature for its own sake and the effort to have it improve society and inculcate virtue reverberated through antebellum politics and influenced the rise of popular culture. So, turning to the works, and despite their shared focus on bereavement, it would be hard to find two antebellum texts that deal with disease and death more differently than Longfellow's Evangeline, 1847, and Poe's Facts in the Case of M. Valdemar, 1845. Written in the hexameters Longfellow mentioned in contrasting himself to Poe, Evangeline tells the sentimental story of a young woman's lifelong separation from her beloved fiancé, Gabriel Lajeunesse. Placed on a different ship from him during the expulsion of the French from Atlantic Canada, Evangeline devotes her life to finding her lost love, traveling for decades throughout the territory that would become the United States, and sometimes just missing Gabriel, like they pass on two sides of an island on a river. She visits, and Longfellow lovingly describes, the Ozark Mountains, the Mississippi River, the forests of Michigan. At the end of her quest in the city of Philadelphia, Evangeline finally encounters Gabriel, an old man on the very brink of death. In a passage near the end of the poem, Longfellow moves from Evangeline's recognition of Gabriel to his momentary awareness of her. The specific disease that finishes Gabriel receives little attention in a poem that uses his death to raise readers' sensibility and affirm the value of loyalty, love, and piety. In the interest of advancing these themes, Longfellow draws us into the story by viewing its painful but uplifting conclusion through the eyes and ears of his characters. As she looks at Gabriel, his face, quote, assumes once more the forms of its earlier manhood, end quote, so that Evangeline has not only finally found her old love, but been transported imaginatively back to her life before their separation. Significantly, Gabriel is also transported by Evangeline's voice. Quote, then he beheld in a dream once more the home of his childhood, green Acadian meadows with sylvan rivers among them, village and mountain and woodlands, and walking under their shadow as in the days of her youth, Evangeline rose in his vision. The brief reunion culminates in Evangeline chastely kissing Gabriel's dying lips, pressing her dead lover's head to her chest, and in a response that would have appalled Melville's Ahab, who's all about rage against the universe, right? She thanks God for this long deferred answer to her prayers. Brace yourself for my next slide. We are entering a different literary universe. By contrast, far from inculcating virtue, Poe's deliberately deceptive, indeed hoaxing story uses what we now call alternative facts, and which Poe called verisimilitude, to trick readers into believing that a man about to die of advanced lung disease could have his death postponed for months by placing him in a mesmeric trance. The hoax is supported by the extensive use of medical jargon and by references to contemporaneous people and events. For instance, the narrator claims to be trying to correct a, quote, garbled or exaggerated account of the experiment that made its way into society, end quote, and promises to deal only in facts as he understands them. Attentive readers could have seen the joking wink-wink undertone, but for many, the experimental use of mesmerism, a little understood precursor of hypnotism, was just mysterious enough to support Poe's hoax. Let's contrast the death scene in Valdemar with Gabriel's passage. Despite trying, Gabriel can't speak, which raises empathy. Valdemar can't stop talking, and what he says falls unnervingly somewhere between the ridiculous and the horrifying, which is a place that Poe often likes to find himself. Quote, "For God's sake," he groans, "quick, quick, put me to sleep, or quick, waken me, quick. I say to you that I am dead." However one responds to this and the earlier incidences in which the dead alive Valdemar answers questions, Poe uses the ending not to affirm God's mercy, long delayed or otherwise, but to nauseate and disgust readers. As Valdemar's body, like the cliched vampires, immediately shrinks, crumbles, and rots into, quote, "a nearly liquid mass of loathsome, detestable putrescence." It's fun to kind of look around in a Poe concordance for the word putrescence. He does like it. Well, anyway, in this story, as in The Raven, more questions are asked than answered, while ideas are bandied about without cohering around a clear message, moral or otherwise. And whether a given reader is credulous enough to take Valdemar as nonfiction, in the end, the tale provides no comfort about the vulnerability of the body or the endurance of the soul. Gabriel's body is a sacred vessel held by Evangeline in a pietà prose. Valdemar's is detestable. Well, that's a relief. I'm going to move on to contrast Longfellow's The Cross of Snow and Poe's The Raven. First, some similarities. Both poems feature a bereaved speaker awake at night, and both take place in a specific room. Here in this room where she died in The Cross of Snow versus my chamber in The Raven. But the differences are far more important when we see that the room in Cross of Snow is pervaded by the aura of Fanny Appleton, while Poe's chamber is invaded by a being whose nature shifts, bird or demon, along with the speaker's changing moods. While Longfellow is describing a familiar experience characterized as occurring in the long sleepless watches of the night, the watching speaker looks back at a single and startling event that occurred famously once upon a midnight dreary. In terms of their publication histories, the poems could not be more different. Longfellow never published The Cross of Snow, which he wrote in July of 1879, 18 years after his second wife was fatally burned in an accident. According to biographer Nicholas Bobbins, Longfellow left the manuscript without instructions among his papers. In contrast, Poe published The Raven to make a splash as part of a publicity-seeking effort, originally in two places within days of each other, the New York Evening Mirror and the American Review in late January or early February of 1845. Confessional and directed inward, Cross of Snow expresses undying admiration for Fanny Appleton and steady, faithful bereavement about her loss. Flamboyantly tricked out in Gothic imagery, The Raven seeks to draw readers into a scene of mysterious horror and agonized self-torment. In the months after The Raven was published, it was widely reprinted, imitated, adapted, and parodied, so much so that 3 months later, Poe observed, quote, "The Raven has had a great run, but I wrote it for the express purpose of running." The Cross of Snow focuses its first 8 lines on the beloved lost one, whose gentle face beams from a portrait on the wall, who died in a flaming martyrdom, whose head is surrounded by a halo, whose soul was white and whose life was benedict. That is legendary in its virtue, blessed. The Raven devotes a total of 7 out of 108 lines to a character appropriately described as the lost Lenore. In these few lines, we learn only in vaguely that Lenore was rare and radiant, is now in heaven, and will never again recline on the speaker's couch cushions. Where Longfellow conveys his experience of traumatic loss, Poe seems to be asking questions not only about bereavement, but also about nature and the supernatural, life and death, heaven and hell, all in the context of a man who claims to be seeking surcease of sorrow while doing everything he can not to stop mourning. Where Longfellow's grief steadily and faithfully clings to the woman he lost, the Raven speaker's grief is self-focused, shifty, and unhinged. Indeed, attentive readers of the Raven take note of how the speaker sinks deeper into pain, first by failing to laugh off the Raven, and then by failing to think clearly about the bird. As always in Longfellow, sanity and piety prevail. The metaphor elaborated from the title in the last 6 lines could be paraphrased as cold comfort, but this would miss the intensity of his incense-like grief, never melting because it lives in a sun-defying ravine. The cross provides an enduring Christian consolation for Longfellow's sorrow. The Raven arrives where the cross of snow starts, at an image of settled, inescapable pain. After a lengthy conversation, which turns darker as the speaker asks increasingly ominous questions and the bird sticks to its only stock and store, the Raven ends up sitting on the bust of Pallas with its beak metaphorically penetrating the speaker's chest and heart. The Raven's appearance allows Poe's speaker to move away from normal sorrow into what he perceives as ghostly mystery, as the rustling of his curtain thrills and fills him with fantastic terrors never felt before. In response, he seeks to reassure himself that the rapping and tapping he heard is just some normal human visitor. When this bird walks in, he tries to joke with it, to laugh it off, taking note of its aristocratic bearing and asking what its lordly name is. Once the Raven speaks its one word second time, the speaker plausibly surmises that nevermore is the only word the bird knows, and that he probably picked it up from an unhappy master who went around saying nevermore all the time. Once he comes to this conclusion, the speaker could just shoo the creature back into the night and return to his studies, but no. Instead, he uses the Raven's predictable response to ask increasingly concerning questions. Will I ever forget Lenore? Will there be balm in Gilead? Will I be reunited with Lenore in heaven? Nevermore, nevermore. Seemingly outraged by the answers that he himself knew were coming, the speaker's experience of bereavement ends in images of gothic horror. The Raven has become a thing of evil, prophet still, if bird or devil, as the speaker shifts from anger to agony in the penultimate stanza. Be that word our sign of parting, bird or fiend, I shrieked upstarting. Get thee back into the tempest and the night's Plutonian shore. Leave no black plume as a token of that lie thy soul hath spoken. Leave my loneliness unbroken. Quit the bust above my door. Take thy beak from out my heart. Take thy form from off my door, quoth the Raven, nevermore. Other than a sense that the speaker is conflicted, to grieve or not to grieve, that's his question, it can be hard to see just what Poe wants us to take from the poem. What, critics have asked, does the Raven tell us about antebellum mourning customs and belief in the immortality of the soul? It's clear that the Raven is an ineffective comforter who fails, indeed, who makes no effort to console the speaker, and that the speaker fails to find relief. It's interesting and revealing to note that critics familiar with both the poem and antebellum mourning customs have arrived at opposing positions. On the one hand, in Communities of Death, Whitman Poe and the American Culture of Mourning, Adam Bradford argues that the ineffective approach to mourning in the poem affirms the power of then conventional effective ways of grieving that involve sympathy from consoling visitors and pious, if enduringly mournful, acceptance by the bereaved. Bradford writes, quote, whether antebellum readers empathized with or were horrified by the speaker's extreme despair, they would respond and were meant by Poe to respond by imagining alternative, positive ways of coping with lost love. On the other hand, Jonathan Cook, writing in the current issue of the Edgar Allan Poe Review, argues that, quote, Poe is using a Gothic framework to portray death as spiritual annihilation, and in this way challenge a fundamental tenet of the nation's Christian faith. Though well argued, both of these incompatible interpretations assume, I think incorrectly, that Poe wrote The Raven to convey the kind of point he assailed in Longfellow. rather than writing a poem written solely for the poem's sake, a poem crafted not to persuade or improve readers, but to affect them, in this case, by providing fantastic terrors never felt before. Because The Raven was widely reprinted and variously adapted following its publication in the winter of 1845, because Nevermore and Quoth the Raven became earworms overnight, attempts to generalize about how readers responded quickly encounter a wide range of reactions. A few of the poems inspired by The Raven suggest that at least some readers did regard Poe's speaker as a model of how not to grieve. As early as May 3rd of 1845 in C.C. Cook's The Gazelle, a young man grieving for his lost love, Isabel, is visited during a daytime mountain hike, not by a raven, but by a white gazelle, who replies not ominously or negatively, but vaguely to his questions by saying, "Fare thee well." The dreamlike experience in which the gazelle morphs into a seraphic and glorious incarnation of Isabel fails to provide clear answers to its speaker, but it strikes a mood closer to the Cross of Snow than to the Raven. More parodic early treatments of the Raven, like the owl and the turkey, treat Poe's speaker with even less respect. In both, the visiting birds encounter a man who is not seeking solace for his lost love, but enduring the indignities of poverty and intemperance. He's a drunkard living in a rooming house in these poems, failures already associated with Poe himself. In conclusion, the contrast between the works I've considered, between Gabriel's dignified death in Evangeline and Valdemar's detestable putrescence, and between Longfellow's aching, steady Christian mourning in The Cross of Snow and the shrieking horror in The Raven. These contrasts cover a wide range of the ways we respond to human vulnerability and loss. It goes almost without saying that neither the longer average lifespans we now enjoy or the medical cures or treatments that support greater health have tended. It goes without saying that neither this nor that have tended only to postpone the inevitable tapping, or is it rapping, on all our chamber doors. Thank you. And I meant to switch over to that. I'll leave it up there now so you can see this. Actually, I'm going to read it because I meant to have it be available that way. And it's just such a beautiful poem. In the long sleepless watches of the night, a gentle face, the face of one long dead, looks at me from the wall, where round its head the night lamp casts a halo of pale light. Here in this room she died, and soul more white, never through martyrdom of fire was led to its repose, nor can in books be read the legend of a life more benedict. There is a mountain in the distant west that, sun-defying in its deep ravines, displays a cross of snow upon its side. Such is the cross I wear upon my breast these 18 years, through all the changing scenes and seasons, changeless since the day she died. Go back over there and we can talk about all this.
All right, so thank you both for these wonderful presentations. In a moment or two, I'd love to open it up to folks in the room, and I'm trying to keep an eye on any questions that come in online as well that I'll endeavor to pose to you. But first, I'd just like to invite you to react or respond to anything that resonated as the other person was giving your presentation, anything that sparked theirs. And I think we can probably open it up.
Well, I have one thought, which is since Tegan looked at the different dying dead wives of the two poets, and it seems to me that in some way, Poe experienced in the lingering death of Virginia, the kind of death that you'd expect in a Longfellow work, drawn out so that it wrought the emotions, and you were constantly reminded of impending danger, vulnerability, mortality. whereas Longfellow leaving Mary Storer out of account, because that was a similar death where you could see it kind of. Longfellow experiences in the death of Fanny Appleton the kind of death that you get in a Poe story. So it's, like a bursting, violent moment of horror. And that's, neither here nor there, but it reminds me of an episode in Stephen King's biography where he was in a horrible automobile accident. He was run down by a truck, and he wrote a New Yorker essay about the experience. And he kind of says, while he was like his body was in agony and, really severely injured, he's kind of picking up the things that the driver of the truck is saying about the whole event and how it happened. And King writes, it was as though I'd been run down and nearly killed by one of the characters in my own novel. So, I do think that it's kind of interesting, and so that's just a thought.
Yeah, I'm not sure I have anything quite so thought-provoking as what you just shared to remark. But I really appreciated getting to look at examinations of death that had some actual literary merit, because I quoted that poem that was very, very pithy and meant for a headstone. And both of those things are the types of things that would be in people's daily lives in the antebellum era. And I mean, just as there are many, many forms of texts and media today, they'd be kind of encountering ideas for what people do with grief from many different sources. And I think, I like to hope that some people felt comfort in Longfellow's work, not The Cross of Snow until much later because it wasn't published. He was known for being sentimental and old-fashioned even in his time. And sentimental and old-fashioned was trendy. So in terms of how you dealt with death. So I think that I wonder what it was like for someone when these things were freshly published, thinking about how that might have changed or affected the experience of grappling with either loss or just uncertainty about a loved one's illness.
It's interesting, Tegan, that one could compile a really interesting book, I think, that consisted of poems about the death of children and babies, because it was such a common phenomenon, as you were saying. But I think if you followed it over time, starting with Puritans, kind of local, like a New England thing, a Boston collection, if you started with Puritan poems, you'd see that the way they experience it is shaped by, it's colored by their theology and their general worldview, right? And then you get up into the Enlightenment and it starts to change, and there's kind of a more secular focus and ways of understanding it. But I do think that it would be an interesting work to see.
Yeah. And I like that you left off with changing more secular ideas with the Enlightenment, because it gives me a chance to respond to that. Because starting really in the mid-19th century, there were pushbacks to that more secular, more Enlightenment thing, both of which I think had a real impact on mourning culture. And I am wading far out of my area of expertise here. When I'm talking about 19th century religious history, but in a nutshell, the spiritualist movement was starting to really blossom at that time. And that was counterculture, but not small. It was a fairly mainstream movement, even though it was responding to things that made it counter in the counterculture. And spiritualism was a belief in life after death that was much more on the ghosts side of things than the angels side of things, although there was definitely overlap. And there were spiritualists who were devout Christians and who were interweaving those two ideas. So this is an era of seances, of mediums, that sort of thing, being a part of how people were grieving. And also became part of a number of social movements. We have ghosts speaking to abolitionists and urging them to move forward in their work. And it's a really pervasive thing. And on the other hand, this is even further from my area of expertise, but evangelical revivals also had a big impact on mourning culture and this idea of kind of the deathbed as being particularly sacred. So I wanted to add to that because I think you're right that tracing these attitudes, the theology is such a big part of it. And it's kind of, it's the background for so much of what we're looking at in this era. I think we're ready for questions.
Yeah, so I would love to open it up online, who have questions or even thoughts to add to the conversation.
Colleagues and they, I was thinking about the spiritualist movement, but like a big part of it was these rappings and tappings. And so as you were reading the poem, I was thinking, oh gosh, I wonder if he's sort of referencing what was going on. I actually don't know the time frame. I'm way out of my depth. But it reminded me of some of the things that were going on with the Fox sisters up in New York who were big into rappings and tappings. I don't actually have a question. I'm sorry, it's just a comment that I was thinking and no one else had raised their hand that I could see.
Yeah, I mean, I actually wondered myself how much Poe was kind of aware of that sort of thing going on, whether it was a little later, maybe. I'm not sure.
I'm just gonna call out somebody in the audience who I'm making eye contact with. The Fox sisters were here. Yeah, Fox sisters made an appearance. Not sure, like from that we'll do some digging. Yeah, yes, please. Okay.
The Fox sisters, so Henry Longfellow himself was very much I think agnostic about spiritualism, but his brother, so Fanny's brother, went to a seance. And I believe it's in his journal entry, there's a great description of Appleton going to the seance and getting whacked in the face by a mattress. And I saw Appleton getting beat up by a mattress. But what you're talking about with the contrast between Poe's wife dying in a Longfellowian fashion and Longfellow's wife dying in a very Poe manner. I'm a seasonal reader here, so I'm kind of a writer. But last summer, one of my friends and I were looking at one of his earliest poetry, just so different light. And in that poem, in that book, he's really working through a lot of his grief for Mary. And it was published in 1839, so he is lost Mary, he has met Fanny, he had so many feelings in the late 1830s. There's one poem in particular called Footsteps of Angels, which explicitly mentions a being beauteous coming to visit him. And there are a few other Longfellow poems I don't have on top of my brain right now, but so Longfellow talking about those, it is a thread that stops up and some of this poetry. I'm just gonna go home and read all of it. A lot of thinking.
So I actually have the text of the poem. Maybe I'll read the last four stanzas that to illustrate your point. With a slow and noiseless footsteps comes the messenger divine, takes the vacant chair beside me, lays her gentle hand in mine. And she sits and gazes at me with those deep and tender eyes, like the stars so still and saint-like, looking downward from the skies. Uttered not, yet comprehended, is the Spirit's voiceless prayer, soft rebukes in blessings ended, breathing from her lips of air. Though oft depressed and lonely, all my fears are laid aside, if I but remember only such as these have lived and died.
Things that are resonating for folks, observations, questions, ideas. Yes, please.
First of all, thank you. Really good presentation. I just thought it was interesting. I feel like when I think of when there are older times in Antebellum period, there's so much death that I always assume people were more desensitized to it. And just that people weren't mourning as deeply as perhaps people do today, just because it's less common. But I just thought that, I haven't read like a lot of his poetry, but I thought that the Longfellow was interesting in that. The way he expressed grief and mourning over 18 years was something so similar to what it's into.
That, what you said kind of resonates for me in part because, as was mentioned in the introduction, I work at the Paul Revere House and Paul Revere had 16 children, 11 of whom survived to adulthood. And he lived a long life, so he ended up surviving most of his children. Most of them died before he did, even those who did live to adulthood. And so, you know, a question that we get asked often by visitors is, you know, 5 of his kids died. Was he were people in that time desensitized to it? Like the exact thing that you asked or that you wondered about is something that people wonder to us quite a bit. And we don't have a good answer because how do you answer? How does someone feel about losing their child? But one thing that we have kind of been able to learn from what research is out there and from our understanding of his biography is that the thing that was different wasn't a feeling of being desensitized so much as the coping mechanisms that were socially available were different. Most people knew someone who had lost a child. Most people knew someone who had lost a spouse young. And so that may have made it somewhat easier because there was that cultural support. I don't know whether this pervasive sense, I keep leaning on the word pervasive, but it's so useful here. I don't know whether that culture in the antebellum era actually made it easier for people or not to grapple with this, but it was the culture that was there. And of course, Paul Revere, we're talking about American Revolution era, so that's bringing it back a generation or two. But this idea that you know, grappling with what's similar and what's different is definitely something that comes up and resonates.
I would like to add something in it. It just, I don't have a fully formed thought about it, but I've been contemplating for quite a while the concept of the denial of death in our culture. And it connects to what you were asking because there is a lot of desensitization now around death because we live in a culture that doesn't want to deal with it at all. And so, you know, to add to what you were saying, Tegan, I think in the past periods of America, at least I'll just stick to America, the fact that there was much more familiarity with death and that society wasn't too turbocharged the way it is now with social media and all that stuff. It just seems that there was more intention, perhaps, in and around death and dying. And I'm not sure I'm going to be able to articulate anything beyond that, but it is thought-provoking.
Is that resonating with either our panelists or anybody else in this room? It struck me, Tegan, when you talked about, you know, this more intimate familiarity with death, people passing away at home, this sort of much more, yeah, it's just an intimate history. And I don't know if any of our friends from that Auburn Cemetery have joined us this evening. Thank you for being here. I have watched with interest some of the events in the past that you posted around, you know, death cafes or conversations, and if any of this is sparking for you, I'd love to put you on the spot.
Yeah. Absolutely, with the denial of death, the term coined by Ernest Becker is a great resource on that kind of psychology emerging. I think in a lot of ways we see more death than we have in history because of social media and because of violence in movies and everything. But I feel like the personal ways that people generally die in hospitals or at home sometimes of sickness, that is not something that's as forefront in our culture.
And so I think a lot of time.
Relationship between a rise in sort of emotionally experienced Christianity and attention to death, like it would seem as though there'd be more consolation for people like that, and so it would be in some ways less wrenching, like you'd have a standard way of responding in a way that more secular loss might not be, but I really don't know. What do other people think about that? Yeah.
Well, were there patterns in rituals of consolation and rituals of burial that can inform any of those trends over time?
A little bit. So I'm going to very, very I don't know, with a broad brush, I guess, divide the century into two halves, roughly, antebellum and after the Civil War. It's a common division, but it's also a crude one. That's what I was reaching for a moment ago, and crudely dividing. And first half of the century, grief rituals were much more concrete and saw dead bodies were much more centered in how people kind of understood death. And the dead bodies certainly didn't go away in the second half of the century. And in fact, I mentioned embalming, so they're around where people had the opportunity to spend more time with a dead body. But the culture around mourning actually became a lot more abstract in that period. So a lot of what you see in that culture, and we didn't talk about that as much because we were focusing on the antebellum era. But this is when you start to see etiquette manuals giving people really elaborate prescriptions for what you can wear when someone dies based on your gender, your relationship to this deceased, how long they've been dead, whether you're interested in being on the dating market again, if your husband or wife has died. All of these things would prescribe what fabrics you can wear, what colors you can wear, how much of each. That's very abstract compared with, can someone please make a watercolor of my dead wife's body? And I think I've strayed quite a bit from your original question, I'm sorry.
No, that's exactly what, because I think of those memento mori made out of hair, and, there's so much
Yeah,
myth making and busy work and kind of let's stay in the moment of death around these rituals and the
Yes.
fabrics, and that to me feels like a way of holding on to the death.
and
And
I think,
elongating the grief in some ways, or perhaps releasing it, depending on who you are.
yeah, I see your question and response.
Well, I was thinking about Queen Victoria and her obsession with death and jewelry and glass versus in our culture right now. It's there, but it's relegated to different, almost like silos, like there's the goth. You wear skulls, you have skulls on your plates, you have skulls on your tattoos. There's the people that use taxidermy and preserve their beloved animals or take their hair of the animals and knit it into sweaters. So I feel like, I know, but it's almost like it's been relegated to other than the actual funeral where to almost these cultural silos. I mean, it's really interesting thinking about it.
Yeah.
That until this lecture, I hadn't thought about how does it show up in our culture. And also our culture has mass death omnipresent and is less personal than the two examples that you gave with Longfellow and Poe. So I'm not sure what this means, but it's just very different.
I am curious, something that Tegan said, all of these rules about grief and mourning, or, kind of behaviors that you should aspire to. How did they treat people in society who didn't follow those rules, like who would break down in a very uncouth fashion?
Great question, and it varied widely. I think that the way that etiquette manuals were written was very idealized, and very few people questioned it if someone did not follow the etiquette manual exactly. And there are even some examples of people who were ridiculed for performing grief too perfectly. So I think there was really a lot of ambivalence about the way this was being done. And I'm again wading out of my area of expertise here. I would like to be able to paint sort of a picture of the waxing and waning, because it did wax and wane, but I'm sorry, I don't have that information off the top of my head, but I think that it was certainly reactions to how to do this, how to mourn, were definitely not uniform at any time, even when death culture and mourning culture was extremely mainstream.
I guess this kind of goes along with that. I was struck by Paul describing the portrait of the Raven as a guy who is not mourning effectively or well, or, you know, kind of a what not to do scenario. Because of that, do you think that the Raven is challenging to the conventions of grief at the time, or supporting it by showing how badly he fails at comforting himself with his?
So I was trying to get at that and trying to make the case that it's not that it's both and, it's neither, because he's not trying to comment on this culture, he's trying to turn it into a kind of horror gothic story. But I do think that, you know, in a way, it's like when you read that poem, and this is true in a lot of post-gothic work, you kind of have a sort of distance from the character. You're sort of seeing how the character handles the experience, and one would not necessarily approve of how he's doing it. That I meant to get at that a little bit, but takes a little bit more text. On the handout, you'll see more what I had in mind. I mean, how do we deal with this kind of horrible grief? You know, humor might have a role. It could be the best medicine. It doesn't really work for him. He moves through it, right? And rationalizing it, understanding it, that might help. But because he is so conflicted, because he doesn't want to let go of his grief, he wants to keep it going. It's a kind of, Poe talked about this as a sort of self-torment. So it's a poem about self-torment, and that also might distance the reader or might draw the reader in. I mean, I think it's a very ambivalent work in terms of like, well, what are we supposed to think about this character? I find it's easy myself to think, I wish that humor and explaining it had worked for him. He could move on and get back to his studies and get a graduate degree and find employment and be less gloomy.
Other questions or ideas?
So was grief a longer process back then?
Culturally, yes. I cannot say whether the cultural emphasis on long grief changed the duration of what the personal experience was like. And I think especially in the later Victorian era, when this very ritualized grief was a big part of the culture, that was definitely a long process. So I mentioned the prescriptive clothing for one of the examples. Some, especially widows, some of them would stay in full mourning for 1 to 2 years and then gradually work their way down over the course of the next decade or more. And it was a socially acceptable choice to stay in mourning forever. And by in mourning, I mean observing certain customs and rituals of mourning. But whether that had a relationship with how long people were grieving and how long it was a part of every minute or every hour as opposed to every day or every week for the person who had lost someone, that I don't think that anyone can answer, but certainly it would take a lot more depth of scholarship to attempt to answer. But it's a great question.
It seems like you couldn't quantify it. Like, what would you even be measuring that would be concrete?
Were there any examples of humor around death? Because I'm thinking of, there's the movie A Death and a Funeral, which is really funny, or Weekend at Bernie's, where it's like you take what's supposed to be sacred and horrifying and it becomes funny. And were there any examples then of doing things like that?
Well, I mean, I think you don't have to leave Poe. You don't even have to leave Valdemar. I find that story to be as funny as it is horrifying, despite all the addresses. Because Valdemar keeps answering questions. They keep bringing him out of his trance, bringing him back in his trance. And he says things just like the one I quoted, I'm dead, I'm alive. It's like, if you're really dead, why don't you just shut up? So that's, but others read that story and take it much more seriously. And I think it did horrify people. The thought that this could actually happen, it was widely taken up as being true, and Poe had to say, to his confidants, no, it's a hoax. But so I think Poe is kind of looking for two different kinds of readers. I think there are other stories where people die, and it's funny. There's a story called "Never Bet the Devil Your Head," about a man who makes that mistake and ends up without his head. It's not a sad or a horrifying story, really. And others too. There's a story called "Loss of Breath," by a man who can get his breath, but somehow goes on narrating his story. So I think that Poe had a real sense of humor about the macabre, obviously, and he's probably the Gothic writer who was most able to navigate between really quite horrific moments and quite humorous ones. In The Fall of the House of Usher, which certainly leads up to a horror Gothic climax, the narrator is said to have been ushered into the presence of his host, right? So even on a punning level, there's humor kind of throughout Poe's even most scary works.
We just got some nonverbal feedback in Zoom, which I didn't know was a thing, that said more.
Tell them we said nevermore.
The etiquette of mourning, do you think it was class related? And did the wealthier do this more? Whereas if you were poor, your wife or your husband did, I would think you would just, man or woman, have to get remarried to survive and put it behind you.
That's another where I'll make the crude distinction between first and second half of the 19th century. The really elaborate stuff was very class stratified in the second half of the 19th century. And that was something where the wealthy could have the luxury to observe these customs as much as they wanted. And then those customs sort of, I don't like using the phrase trickled down, but people of working classes sort of participated in a smaller scale. Much of the mourning culture of the antebellum period didn't necessarily rely on the ability to kind of be showy about it or things like that. And I would argue that remarrying quickly was not incompatible with the way that they were grieving at the time. So, outpourings of grief, and one of the audience members mentioned hair jewelry. So trying to keep people kind of physically with you. I think people participated in that even when economic realities were asking them to move on with their daily lives. I think that's something that's different between the mainstream of the 19th century and the mainstream of today is that today, if we say that someone is moving on from a death and they get back to their daily life, and at that time, the death, the loss, the bereavement becomes part of their daily life from that time forward. I'm making another broad generalization there, but I hope that helps.
So Poe has a wonderful horror story called Ligeia, and it's specifically about a man whose first wife dies and very quickly marries again. And I'll just say it doesn't go well.
Spoilers here.
While the ghost of the first wife.
Oh, yes. She is determined not to die. And I think before she dies, she's going to try to will herself not to die. She's very willful, and I think therefore kind of gendered bad woman and wife because she's so dominating. And she's determined not to die, but she dies. She's in an Edgar Allan poster, so that kind of thing will happen. But then, yes, she comes back to torment, and at least the narrator, who's kind of drinking a lot and doing opium, he thinks she comes back. And none of it's good for the second wife.
I think we have time for probably one more question or one more comment. Ooh, okay. One and then two.
Tegan, would you be willing to say more? You mentioned at the beginning that your own experience in the past year made you see all of the material you're working with differently. Can you speak more to that? It's almost like the juxtaposition of our denial of death and everything you're immersed in.
Sure. So, in that period I mentioned, I was nearer or farther from just a number of deaths, both expected and unexpected. Some people in my communities who were my own age, my very elderly grandmother, kind of running the gamut of experiences. And, reading about loss in other time periods, I can picture someone sobbing because their sister is dead, because I've seen someone I love very deeply do that. I've been the shoulders that were getting the tears, and I can see someone crying for their child because I have seen it. And, that's why I mentioned at the beginning that, in addition to, that I personally see it differently, in doing history, it's very important not to project from the present to the past. But some things I think that we can understand and share without it being a projection. We can be aware of the ways it might be. We can aware of the risks of projection without, and so I think that, for me, it became difficult to turn off my awareness of, what it looks like to go through grief. I knew before, but then I went through a bad period of losing people. And so, and I don't know whether I would want to be able to turn that off. It would be personally comfortable and convenient to be able to turn off that awareness while doing research and turn it back on as needed as an extra lens, because it does make the subject matter more painful. Yeah, I'm not quite sure how to wrap up what I'm saying there, but I hope that explains a little more what I meant in that intro.
I wonder, just in follow-up, is there a perspective that you've gotten on contemporary life and what we are missing in terms of our relationship with death?
I'm conflicted about that. I think that many people who study death in the past feel that death is too taboo today, and that taboo is harmful. And I think that was touched upon in what the folks from Mount Auburn were saying. And I do agree with that. But that doesn't mean I've necessarily found any models that I think are particularly great to emulate. They're very culturally specific. They're very context specific. I come at it from the perspective of looking at health and medicine, and health and medicine also includes lack of health and failures of medicine, or not even failures. I mean, we're mortal, and medicine will never fix that. But within history of medicine, there's certainly a tendency to over clinicalize, and I think that as someone who is not a medical doctor or any form of doctor, but who does history of medicine kind of from the social history angle, I have never been quite as much at risk for that tendency to clinicalize, but I do think that studying cultures in which that clinical gaze was not a big part of the mainstream approach to death, that's definitely something that they were getting right, even though they weren't getting it right with the choices. You know, they didn't have the option to necessarily look at death in the same way that we might today with the, you know, bright hospital lights and antiseptic solutions and everything that we have today and associated with death.
Thank you. So we are just about at our time. I will turn it back to our panelists for any final word. It's not a required final word. All right. So thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you for this rich conversation, both to Paul and to Tegan and to all of you. Thanks to those of you who joined us on Zoom and bore with us through some not terribly unexpected technical difficulties. Thanks to our friends at Non-Auburn Cemetery for helping us put this program together and for sponsoring. And thank you to our friends at the Friends of Longfellow House Washington's headquarters for making the Zoom component possible. Shout out to John Bell. We will make this recording available. We have just a couple minutes before 7:30 if anybody else wants to connect or ask Paul and Tegan more about where you can find more of their work. I will share the link out to folks tomorrow to Tegan's past lecture with us, as well as some other resources that they mentioned, and some book recommendations and all kinds of stuff. So thank you once again so much to Paul Lewis and Tegan Kehoe. I've been looking forward to this event for months and it exceeded all expectations. And thanks to you for again making this a really rich conversation.
Well, that was fun for